This whole situation that college football is in right now, there's not an easy fix, and if there was, we still probably wouldn't be able to implement it anyway because nobody's in charge.
Hey, welcome to Beat Everyone. I'm Ben Flanagan with AL.com, and let's just be honest about the college football playoff. It was a dud. It stunk. I mean, the opening rounds were all pretty much blowouts. The ratings were weak, and there was little to no fanfare heading into the final between Ohio State and Notre Dame, especially because it was sandwiched between the NFL's divisional playoff round and the upcoming conference championship games. Joining me to talk about this are AL.com college football writer Michael Casagrande and Beat Everyone producer Matt Scalici. Matt, I want to start with you. And then, Michael, please jump right in. Am I wrong? Am I just being a hater because Alabama wasn't in the playoff or because the SEC didn't dominate it? Even it had a meager 3 teams, so how could it? Or was that a stinker of a first year for this new 12-team format?
Ben, for a variety of reasons, I didn't really enjoy it. And I'm sure, look, I'm gonna rightly be accused of team-specific bias. But I don't think that even Alabama fans are alone in feeling this way. I think a lot of people came into this, frankly, with a lot of excitement. I think, to me, my perception of this was most people, even if people who had reservations, were interested to see how this new postseason format would play out. There was excitement for, as much as any big change in college football can have excitement around it, I really think there was excitement and some optimism around it going into it. And I think the first experience of it did not satisfy. I think a lot of people came away feeling like this is not necessarily an improvement over what we had. I think that there's a lot more fan bases who got to enjoy the experience of their team making the playoff. Are even those fan bases happy with how this all went? Right? I think it's probably pretty safe to say Texas and Georgia fans and Tennessee fans are not thrilled with how this went. But even beyond that, I mean, the teams that
they lost.
Let's say the teams that, I mean, and that's how playoffs work. If you are in the playoff, everybody except one team loses. Okay, and that's great. We all somehow love college basketball's tournament anyway, even though everybody who's in it loses except for one team. But that said, I think college football has not always been that way. There has been a way to consider your season a success, even if you do not win a national championship. And in some ways, I'm not sure that a lot of the teams that made this playoff feel that way. I even would be curious to know if Arizona State fans and Boise fans and the sort of Cinderella teams that made it in, did they even enjoy this? Was this a good experience for them? I don't know. And I for the most part, my perception looking out there in college football social media is there's a lot more complaints than praise about this playoff this season.
Okay. First off, you guys both sound like biased. You guys, I'm going to say that right out.
That's fine. And I totally accept that. What I would say is, like, just discuss the rest of the merits beyond.
I will.
We're mad that Alabama didn't get in.
Okay. I don't want to be that guy, the participation trophy, the everyone gets a trophy kind of thing. But, like, that's what happens in every other sport. Like, teams, there's one champion and everyone else isn't. Like,
and is that why we liked college football, is because it wasn't like other sports?
I mean, perhaps, but like making the playoff is what people were wanting to say, be able to say that they did. So if teams can say, yeah, 11 teams lost to end the playoff, but they made the playoff, they can say they were a playoff team. That seems to be like what everyone wanted to be able to say to get into this 12-team field, to be a playoff team. I feel like that is going to be something they're going to recruit on. SMU, you don't think they're going to talk about they were a playoff team?
I think probably SMU considers this season a success. I think probably Clemson feels a lot better about it at the end of the season than they did like 2 weeks before the end of the season, maybe. But maybe other than them, like, does Notre Dame even feel good about this? All they got rewarded with was to get to another championship game and get their hearts stomped on again.
Well, I mean, they got to the championship game and they lost to a better team. I think bottom line, at the end of the day, what is a playoff supposed to do? They're supposed to crown a champion. I think they crowned the best team as a champion. I think that makes it a success. They were the best team in the nation, and they proved it.
And that I will not dispute. I think it's clearly what ended up happening is the best team won this season. So would the best team have won in a 4-team format also?
No, they wouldn't have. They wouldn't have even been in the playoff. Ohio State wouldn't have been in the 4-team playoff. So
I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but it's a fair debate. It would have been less certain that they would be in for sure.
I mean, they're like it was a 7 and 8 seed playing for the championship.
Yeah, but we don't. The seeds are. We'll get into that. The seeds are garbage, and we'll get into that.
If you take out Boise, you take out Arizona. I don't think they'd be one of the top 4. I don't think
you should take out Arizona State and Boise. You should have taken them out from the beginning. And SMU, nobody cared about those teams. Here's the reason. The reason, and look, let's look inward as people who cover Alabama. The reason this system was flawed is because Alabama was even part of the conversation, right? As the 13th or 14th best team looking in, like, we should not care about how the 13th seed or 12th best team in the country figures into the national championship conversation. Arizona State and SMU didn't deserve to play to win it all. They didn't do enough during the regular season to earn that. I mean, this was obviously a TV play. This was obviously a revenue play to create more games, to create more television shows, to create more ad dollars, and that's understandable. Maybe it's good business, but it was not a good product. It was a bad college football product, and the result that we got was a middling final that nobody cared about. Fewer people watched than normal, and it wasn't a very good game. It was lopsided, and it's because of the reason that you said, Michael, that Ohio State was clearly a better team. But they also got more opportunities to prove that they were the best team, because in better systems in recent history, they would have screwed themselves out of that opportunity because they didn't take the regular season seriously enough as a team, even with all that talent. But they were afforded the luxury of doing that because the regular season's impact and meaning was diluted because of this new system. To me, the importance and the value of the college football regular season and playoff, for that matter, was totally diluted. It was not as good of a season as years past. Maybe it will improve. The one thing that I really enjoyed was the opening rounds. The home games were great. It created a great college football atmosphere, a playoff atmosphere, even though the games didn't deliver. I loved the idea of giving home crowds or giving these teams a home team advantage. That ups the stakes immediately. Unfortunately, the games weren't very good, but that's the one thing that they have to go on. Otherwise, it was a dud to me. I just think the product itself, the games, like, we only got a couple of good games out of this playoff.
Well, you only get a couple of good games in the 14 playoffs as well. I mean, if you look back at the history of those games, awful semifinals with the 4 teams. So
I don't know about the percentage of it in terms of good games in the semifinals. The thing about it previously, though, right, is blowing somebody out in a semifinal in a 4-team playoff has more significance to it, I think. And I think that's part of what felt so unsatisfying about those first round games. Is it wasn't just that it was a blowout. It was that one of the two, the team getting blown out wasn't really even supposed to be there in the way that this sport has always existed. And I understand fundamentally we're changing that, but like, that's part of the issue here. It's not like, oh, wow, Ohio State blew out Tennessee. It was like, well, yeah, they blew out Tennessee. Tennessee's not very good. They haven't really at any point this season shown that they were capable of competing with somebody like Ohio State. So it feels very much like some of these games were as much of a foregone conclusion as you can get in college football, which is a sport that we mostly love because of how unpredictable it is.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, it wasn't perfect. I'm not going to be an apologist for everything. I'm not wearing a college football playoff hat, but the teams that shouldn't have got buys, I mean, Arizona State, but that was also one of the better quarterfinal games. They damn near beat Texas. So that was like an entertaining game. And none of the 4 teams that got buys won. It was interesting. So it wasn't straight chalk. It wasn't like it was like a straight chalk game at 7-8. I mean, clearly they weren't 7-8 in reality because of the seedings and the automatic qualifiers, but it wasn't as, there's more to it than just I think it's overly simplistic to say that it was a dud. I think it was exciting. I was excited for it. I was pretty excited for that Saturday of quarterfinal games or the on-campus games where there's 3 in a row. They weren't great games, but it was exciting to see.
There was hype around it, and what I would like to ask, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping the line here, Ben, Michael, like this was my perception that people were sort of done with the season going into this national championship game. Do you feel like is it just me and my heavily Alabama social media feed, or do you feel like there was reduced excitement going into this game?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot going on that day. I think there was a lot going on in the world to where some things could get lost in the wash. I think that was maybe part of it. I think maybe it extended too long. It's a fundamental question of calendars and time frames. I mean, if you get rid of conference championship games or you make that part of it, you can slide the calendar up a little bit so that it's not running into the final third of January. I think that's something that could be adjusted. But when you have 4 rounds of games, there's only so much. You need to have certain runway between each game. It's one of those unfortunate things I think they need to figure out. There are a lot of things they need to figure out. They need to fix a lot of the seating the way they do. I don't know if they're going to do it for the next year, but when they rebuild it again for 26, I think there'll be hopefully some changes because structurally there were definitely issues, and I think the date of the game was definitely one of them.
The Alabama component just doesn't matter because, I mean, if it was a 4-team playoff, Alabama wouldn't have even been in the conversation, right? I mean, Alabama fans can acknowledge that even 4-team playoffs that went on without them, and there were obviously very few of those, were great. I mean, think about 2019, right, when Alabama fell short. But, I mean, you had LSU and Oklahoma and Clemson and Ohio State in a great semifinal game. You had 4 great teams that were battling it out. And, for college football supremacy, whatever. And it was clear that those were the 4 best teams. But, I mean, it was never perfect with 4. It was obviously never perfect with the BCS. There's always going to be a team on the outside looking in. But the fact that we're reaching that point with a 13th and a 14th team, I think, is ridiculous because they don't belong in that conversation. They haven't been that good all year, and they don't deserve that opportunity to be the national champion. They just didn't do enough because that's what made college football so great for so long. And it seems like that has kind of been lost in the fold here, is that it was all about the regular season. Everybody hung on every single game. Every single game mattered. You had to have a relatively pristine resume in order to even be considered a part of that conversation. And I know that was frustrating for a lot of programs, and programs like Alabama certainly got the benefit of the doubt more often than not. And was that fair? Probably not. But is that what more people wanted to see? I think yes. So, whether that's Alabama or whatever dominant program, if it was Ohio State, if it was Florida, I think in the end, people want to see those teams in the playoff. Obviously, you want to see the best teams, and you want to see the most competitive football, and you want high ratings, and you want entertainment, and you want a good product. I just don't think we got it this year because I think that it was all diluted by having too many teams in the conversation. That's my biggest problem with it.
Were you any less interested in the regular season this year? Were you tuning it out because you thought that it didn't matter as much?
I think the fact that 9-3 teams, knowing that going into the playoff, did kind of, again, devalue the product in a way because, again, yes, if you're watching it from an Alabama perspective, maybe there is some excitement that Alabama still has a chance even when they have 3 losses, and you're having to make the case for how bad were those losses, how good were those wins. But I would rather watch undefeated teams play for the whole thing instead of 9-3 teams who feel like they can kind of slum it against teams like Vandy or Oklahoma, and they still have a shot of getting in, and if they can make the argument to the subjective committee.
I'm gonna be a big time hater for a second here and say the two sort of I know we've been maligning Boise State and Arizona State to start this off.
You guys have
the ones, yeah, sure. The ones that actually I think are great examples of the devaluing of the regular season are actually Indiana and Penn State to me.
And Tennessee.
Well, sure. Tennessee at the I think because you can look at their resume and say
nobody thought they were a playoff team.
What's the real highlight here, And it's probably beating an Alabama team that wasn't really that good in the end. But the reason why Penn State and Indiana to me are great examples of what's wrong with this system is there weren't even opportunities during the season to look at these teams and go, this game really counts. Like, this is the do or die game for these guys, because they weren't even put in positions where they were going to be challenged. And when they were and they lost, it didn't matter. They got in anyway. So like kind of the ultimate example of the devaluing of the regular season is when none of the sort of contentious results, none of the games that could go either way actually will prevent this team from getting into the playoffs. It was almost like as soon as we were like 3 or 4 weeks into the season and people were already sort of correctly assessing there was basically no way Indiana wasn't going to make the playoffs. That sucks to me. I mean, they would have had to stumble and lose to a really bad team, which does happen in college football. I think it should be harder than that. I think
it's also because the Big Ten is diluted, and these conferences are diluted because and they don't play representative schedules. They don't play even equal schedules within conferences because they're so big, 18, 19 teams. Like you can thread the needle in that through whatever.
And you can look at it for next year. I mean, you could almost already pick out multiple Big Ten playoff teams next season just from looking at the schedule right now.
But you also wouldn't have seen Indiana. You wouldn't have looked at their schedule. You wouldn't even be talking about them in January of 24 based on anything.
On previous success, sure, yeah.
So
I forgot Indiana was in the playoff, to be honest with you.
They
like when you said Indiana, I was like, oh yeah, who did they play?
Yeah, they weren't for long, for sure.
I mean, there are certainly flaws, and I think there are ways. I've written about it. I've written columns about how they can improve the selection process because there were flaws. I think without a doubt, flaws. At the very least, the automatic qualifiers, the automatic buys for conference champions, those were not the 4 best teams, and clearly all 4 of them got beat. So I think there are things they can fix.
Yeah, I don't know. Like part of me is let's go extreme and make conference championships, conference championship games part of the playoff, right? Like sponsor those games, play them on the bowl sites. I don't know, eliminate conference championship games altogether. Pick one or the other. I think that might be the more logical solution, and maybe something that could happen in the near future. But I don't know. There are things to like about it. On the whole, and the idea of it was exciting, that it was expanding and more teams would get an opportunity. And you're right, it would create a better experience for those fan bases and for college football fans as a whole. And I love the on-campus games. I think they should keep doing that. That creates a lot of excitement for fans in general. But I don't know. It's obviously going to stay 12, and I've heard people even say it should expand even beyond this. I think that would be a huge mistake at this point based on this first season, and I hope that they see that.
I don't know how you would expand it. I mean, just from a practical standpoint, unless you got rid of the buys, that seems like the only way you can get more teams.
14 had been at least kicked around. They're still meeting the commissioners. They're all talking about it, and getting rid of the conference championship games, that would require them, these commissioners would have to have guarantees that the payout would be bigger without them. Because, those are big money games that they get paid by the networks.
And they're also, by the way, I know nobody cares about this except for fans, but to me, mostly the conference championship games have continued to be a great product in a way that a lot of these other things are not as consistently good. The SEC championship game is a pretty consistently competitive and fun event every year. The ACC has had some really good championship games. They certainly had one this year. I think it hasn't been quite that for the Big Ten, and maybe they're incentivized to do away with it because of that. And if there's, to me, winning the conference should still feel like a big deal and like it has consequences. And I would hate for that to be totally eliminated at the expense of a postseason that is always going to be somewhat of a letdown for most of the teams involved.
Remember the narratives? Should Alabama want to even make the conference championship game? That's awful because they just assumed that they would get in, or Ole Miss felt that way at one point too.
And the ACC is already sort of making a mockery of that whole idea now with this thing they're proposing. I don't know if we want to go into that or not.
I just mean it didn't matter. Ultimately, it didn't matter who won or lost the SEC championship this past year because Georgia and Texas both got in, right? And so
it didn't matter in 2017 either, right?
Well, that's true, but I mean, with Ohio State,
no, it did. I think it did matter.
Didn't matter in 2011.
It had consequences in 2017 because the team that lost wasn't going to make the playoffs, and you had to win it to get in. Now
that was true for Ohio State.
Somebody that didn't happen to be in the SEC championship game in 2017 also happened to get in, but like you had to win the game if you were going to be in it.
Ohio State was kind of like the bizarro, but sort of like expanded format version of that this year, where they had their rival game. They lost to Michigan, a bad Michigan team. They still made the playoff anyway. They make a run, but that was their second loss of the season when they lost to Michigan. And most people thought, okay, that's it, just because they looked so bad towards the end of the year because they lost to a hapless team. But since the field had expanded, 2 losses was plenty to get you in because you're talking about teams that had 3 losses who may have deserved a spot, right? Like Alabama, like Ole Miss, like South Carolina. So I don't know, like to me, exclusivity is what makes sports, right? Because you have these last teams standing at the end of a rigorous, competitive regular season that, in the case of college football, was one of the most exciting things about sports in general, was that week to week, you were hanging on to the result of every single game. And what made college football so great was that it wasn't the NFL, and some crappy team wasn't going to make the playoff or win at all. I mean, you had losing teams making the playoffs in some cases, and extreme examples in the NFL, and nobody wants to watch that, right? You want to reward teams that do well during the regular season. And if you expand the field and let anybody in, then what are you saying about your own product that you don't even care who wins this tournament? You just want more teams, because any team could go on a run. Any team who gets a bye could lose their momentum. Teams that deserve to be there and they get a bye, and it happens in the NFL all the time. Look at the Detroit Lions. They're sitting there waiting for their next opponent, and they just get run over a team that has momentum. That's the way playoffs work. That's the way it works in baseball a lot. And now it's the way it works in college football. If you have a bye, just because you're one of the best teams, that doesn't mean you're going to walk out of there because you might not have enough momentum. I just think that you hurt the regular season, you hurt college football, and that's what we saw this year.
Well, I guess you could ask a coach, would you rather have a bye, or would you rather put your players back out there for another game where there were a lot of injuries in those first-round games too that probably impacted teams down the road? So, I mean, there were teams that lost games that had byes that they weren't necessarily the best teams. I mean, even the way Oregon really getting rewarded with being the number 1 overall seed by having to face Ohio State in their quarterfinal game in the Rose Bowl. Maybe the way they pair teams up should be assessed, because Ohio State was clearly the hottest. I mean, they were hottest right after that, but right before that in the first round game, they weren't before. So
I think that's one of the big issues with how this was handled too, that makes it frustrating to watch for people who are sickos enough to force themselves to endure the college football playoff rankings show on a regular basis, which I don't recommend doing. But if you're going to do it, you got to listen to these guys on the committee. The way they like to describe this stuff is it's like they're not allowed to actually make any decisions or assessments themselves. Yeah. There's so much of it was like, well, it's just really out of our hands. There's all these rules that we've set up, and we just have to put X team in. We have to put them where we put them in terms of the seeding. Like, I think that's a big thing that needs to be redressed in the changes that come after next season. Is we all, I mean, as much as everybody used to complain about committees and selection process, we all understand that because of the nature of college football, this is not something that you can choose postseason participants using math, right? You can't do it using statistics. Like ultimately, human beings who know and understand and care about this sport have to make decisions. And I just think they tried to take too much of the responsibility off of themselves in terms of choosing who got to be in this playoff.
I don't know,
And
man.
where they're seated too.
This was making me wonder, did we take the BCS for granted? Was that the right system?
Well, that's
Just
what I
two
wrote
teams?
that.
Yeah.
I wrote that in terms of picking teams. I like the combination. I think it was opposite, actually. I think that they had way too much discretion without any sort of like real need for explaining.
Well, they were
any.
making it up, but I think the way that it was often phrased was like that they didn't have a choice in the matter.
Well, they had certain parameters that they were kind of buttonholed into how they could do it. But I said take all that out of it, decentralize it, because so much power is centralized within that committee and the rules they were given. If you widen it out to polls, not the AP, but like they had the Harris poll, they had the coaches poll, and then they had the computer rankings that the computers, you say, can't make any decisions, and you kind of spread out that decision making process instead of 12 or 13 people in a room with no oversight and no real, they never showed their math, as I kept writing. Like, you have the math right in front of you, so at the very least you can't complain about whatever they say, because this is a broader spectrum that is polled.
Let's take a break from fixing college football. We'll get back to it in just a second, but I want to shift gears. I want to talk about the former Alabama head coach. During an appearance on the Pivot podcast, Nick Saban was asked if he had any regrets in his college coaching career or in his coaching career. And he said, quote, "When I left LSU, that was probably professionally the biggest mistake that I ever made," end quote. Saban won a national championship at LSU before taking the Miami Dolphins job, before returning to college football and leading Alabama to 6 more titles. Michael, how should Alabama fans feel about this admission from Nick Saban?
It's completely understand it. I mean, it's understandable in every sense. I mean, if he should have never gone to the Dolphins, he should have known. He's coached the NFL. He should know the NFL was not the right place for him and his style and the way he wants to operate things. So it has nothing to do with Alabama. It's not. He's not saying that he's saying he should never have had the child from in the future in some other sort of like situation. I don't know. There's some kind of weird, probably comic book movie that you guys could probably think of that this parallels, but like it has nothing to do with Alabama in the sense that it makes total sense. He shouldn't have left LSU, and it shouldn't hurt anyone's feelings that would be his biggest regret. It's the most honest thing he could say. And for him to say anything otherwise would have been disingenuous.
But Matt, let me ask you this though. I don't know if we want to talk about like number 49 of like a Vision comic or something like that, where you think of a scenario that parallels this. But I mean, I think that there are some Alabama fans out there who do think that Nick Saban, LSU was always his first love, so to speak, right? And if he could have gone back to LSU, he would have. Isn't this kind of like admitting that you still have feelings for your ex and you'll never get over your ex?
Well, look, here's what I would say. It's more like, look, you can't undo what you've done. So there's no going back once you leave. There is nothing to go back to because you've changed that situation immediately. And that's, I think, where he feels regret was that he knew that the best situation for him was college. I encourage everybody to go find the clip, because Saban is so unusually emotional talking about this, and it makes you realize how sincere he's being about it. But I think the feeling he has about it more so is, I shouldn't have ever had this blip in my career, in my college career. I should have stayed the course the whole time. And look, I think part of the reason he ended up at Alabama, of all the places he could have gone when he did decide to go back, was that it was a great situation. And in many ways, even though he had built really something special at LSU, there were some advantages I think Alabama had that he maybe wouldn't have had at LSU. But the interesting part about it to me, um, when you're talking about the sort of fan feeling about it, Ben, I think Saban's time at Alabama remains, to me, it will always have some amount of feeling of he was a professional and he was the best there is at what he did. But some fans have a preference for guys who sort of bleed their team colors, right? And they're immersed in the culture of the school that they coach for. That's a very old school mentality. And I don't think that Saban, I don't think it was like he got away from it or anything. I just don't think he was ever that to Alabama. And in some ways, he sort of reshaped what the culture is at Alabama because of that. I think Alabama bent to him rather than the other way around. But look, and as much as anybody can ever have an even remotely negative feeling towards Nick Saban at Alabama, there's always going to be those some fans who are like, he didn't get the Iron Bowl. And I think Saban has even said that in his year as a commentator, is like, I didn't really think it would be any different, and I was wrong. It was different than the other games. So like, he's not a Gump, he's not a Bammer. And that's part of what made the whole arrangement what it was and why it was so successful. But it is unusual maybe in college football.
Well, how many championships would you trade for him to be bathed in houndstooth? And if this
zero,
is zero, this is like the most first world complaint I would ever hear.
This is the pro Dabo type crowd that I'm discussing here. Really, these are the people that thought Dabo should have been the successor.
He should have got a phone call. Matt.
I mean, come on. This is sad. I mean, this is the most honest. Saban would have never said this in the past. This is a very
I agree. I love
saying this.
I love it. I love how, in this world, Michael, where like we talk to so many people who have their mask on and their shield up the whole time you're talking to them, never say make it their job to never say anything interesting. Saban has been so fascinatingly honest in the year that he's been away from coaching.
Well, I'm not going to get specific or personal with anybody here. So let's just say hypothetically, a person is 80 something years old. They're a grandparent. They have been married for, 55 years or whatever it is. They've built this amazing family and life for themselves. And they've just shared a life of happiness with the person that they love. And they say as much to them, but then they say to them, but there was this one girl back in college. And I'll always look back at that and wonder what if and why I left town. That's what it kind of feels like, I think, for Alabama fans to hear this. I don't know.
I think it worked out for everybody.
It did. It obviously did.
And I know LSU probably has some what ifs about the whole situation, but you won 2 national championships after Saban with 2 coaches who there's no way anybody would have thought those guys would have won national championships.
So is Alabama fan, are they like Carmelo Soprano? They had to deal with some stuff along the way, but at the end of the day, they had a great life and a beautiful home and a family. So,
Michael, now you're speaking. Now we found a pop culture middle ground between us.
How you see The Sopranos is how you probably look at the MCU. That's for me. I'm not a Sopranos guy.
Ben's not a Sopranos guy.
No. Not everyone has taste.
Well, other people can see Scorsese ripoffs and spoofs where others can't. It's like, be yourself, be yourself. All right. Well, I want to talk about another thing from that podcast. It's a really good listen. Everybody should go check it out. Another moment from it is Saban said, and we can get back to this larger conversation about college football because he had something to say about it. But he said that if he were to coach right now, and he obviously just retired after 17 years at Alabama, he said that he would rather do it in the NFL instead of college, where he had such historic success. And he said, quote, the whole idea of what college used to be is not there anymore. It used to be you went to college to develop your value You went to college to develop value for your future. Now people are going to college to see how much money they can make. And Nick Saban has obviously acknowledged and said many times he thinks players should be paid. He just has issues with the current system. Matt, even in his retirement, Nick Saban is one of the faces of college football as a member of ESPN's College Game Day panel. He is a beloved figure beyond even where he coached for 17 years in Tuscaloosa, and he just took a shot at the current system because of the advent of things like NIL, the transfer portal, and other things that he has cited as drawbacks since he left college coaching. What does it say about college football when Nick Saban is pointing out its flaws like these so publicly?
So I don't mean this as a criticism necessarily of Saban, but I think you have to understand in a situation like this that people who have benefited from a system are always going to think that the way that it was when it was benefiting them is superior. And so that's his perspective. And I mean, whatever, bias is a word that would describe it, but generally, of course, Nick Saban thinks that if he had all the power, it would be better. And in his situation, he happened to be correct because he had almost total authority and everything went really well when he did because he was the best at what he did. I think it's important when talking about this to acknowledge that actually not every coach was like Nick Saban, and in fact none of them were except for him. So for the most part, for every Nick Saban, there were 100, 150 head coaches at a major program who didn't do things the right way, who didn't set their players up for success. And as a result, players had their careers derailed, ruined, a variety of things that they had no say over, no control over, no way to fix it after that had happened. And just because Nick Saban happened to put the vast majority of his players in a great position for their career and future life does not mean that that's how the system worked for most of the players in college football back when NIL didn't exist and back when the players didn't really have any control over their own careers and have the autonomy to change schools if things weren't working for them.
And for as much credit as I gave Saban about his last answer, I'm going to give him just as much about the opposite for this one. It's nonsense. He just got done saying his biggest regret was going to the NFL, and now he says he wants to go. He would go to the NFL. I mean, it's one of those things like, all right, here's a job. Take you for real. Like, let's go ahead and do it. You know, it's easy to say that.
It's because it's not the same anymore. I mean, I guess is what he's saying. Like it's
easy to say. It's an easy thing to be like, oh, I would go to the NFL over the college. Like nonsense. You wouldn't do either one of them. And if the NFL was never right for you, and it's still not right for you, and just because college football changed and I don't want to say your advantage, or it's what he would use and what the structure that he was able to build, like you said, like it's no longer there. And so he picked the perfect time, like I've written, to retire because it makes it look like he went out on top. But it was always going to come down. It was always the playing field was always going to level in a certain sense, and he was wrong for always saying that the NIL was going to make the rich richer. I mean, I published a column the day he retired, the morning, not that this is why he retired, but it was funny that I went back and looked at that saying that he was wrong about how the rich weren't going to get richer, that it was going to distribute the wealth in a different way that was going to hurt him and his ability to do what he always had done. So, I don't know. It's easy to say now.
Yeah, it's complicated. This whole situation that college football is in right now, there's not an easy fix, and if there was, we still probably wouldn't be able to implement it anyway because nobody's in charge. That's kind of the fundamental issue here, is that there's a lot of people making suggestions of how to fix this, and there's even people in the government who are trying to push things. Nobody actually has the ability and the authority to fix this right now, and that's what's such a big mess about this whole
the beauty of college football, right? And then we're talking about, it's so different from everything else. It's like so different from everything else because it is completely ungovernable.
Yeah, it's weird. It's very tough, and I wish that I felt. I don't want to be pessimistic about it, I wish I could say that I think they're going to figure this all out, but I'm not really super confident that they're gonna, and I don't really know where it's going. It certainly seems like everybody would be incentivized to come up with some kind of solution here, but I don't know that there's a lot of common ground in terms of the things the different sides are disagreeing about. I mean, ultimately, what this comes down to is um, players want to be able to have their own best interests at heart, and those are a lot of times totally diametrically opposed to what's in the best interest of the schools and the coaches. And I don't know. I don't know where we can all meet here.
Well, look, I mean, Nick Saban's not alone. There have been other coaches to say your lifestyle, weirdly enough, is going to be better in the NFL compared to what it is in college right now. Nick Saban has said that. Other coaches have too. Some coaches have left for the NFL. Look at Jim Harbaugh. As soon as he could, as soon as they won that national title, he ran back to the NFL. And it's probably because that's where he wanted to be anyway. But and so maybe that's
there were
unique
circumstances with that too.
Yeah, certainly there are, but there are other coaches who have left, right? I mean, it makes sense. But Nick Saban was also on this podcast, sort of like talking about all the ways coaching in the NFL was a drag while he was there, right? Like he's told the Drew Brees, Jonte Culpepper story over and over. He told it again on this podcast where he just obviously doesn't have as much control at the NFL level as he did in college, and he could be an authoritarian, basically. The dictator, as people have called him for so many years. But that's changed. He doesn't have as much control. No coach has as much control. I think the power balance is probably going to at some point shift back to what it was in some ways once there is some regulation in college football, once it is governable, if it ever reaches that point, because I can't think that these programs, the ADs, the coaches, the boosters, the boards of trustees are going to be happy with the player empowerment era, as it were, in terms of the NIL and how it's a free-for-all right now in the Wild West, as so many people put it. So I do anticipate there being some regulation. I just don't know what exactly it's going to look like. But I understand what he and these other coaches are saying. But yeah, it seems like Saban in this case certainly trying to have it both ways. I think that at some point he would have figured it out. I mean, he's a guy who adapted to everything during his college football coaching career, but this was obviously a lot different. But I think if anybody was in position to figure out sort of how to navigate it, it probably would have been Nick Saban. But it just, I'm sure, was at a point in his life when he just decided, you know what, I'm getting too old. I don't have time for this. I don't want any part of it. And I understand that too. And maybe using age as an excuse isn't fair either. And maybe he just wasn't up for it.
I mean, he adapted to everything on the field. He adapted to different playing styles, but this is a whole nother world that was outside of his control. And he said, he couldn't. I think the very structure of the changes is what negated his advantage, you might say. So he couldn't fix the hurry up, no huddle. He couldn't hire Lane Kiffin. He couldn't do this or that to put Band-Aids on what were, on field issues. This was much bigger than that. And he's the most political minded of all the coaches, but even he couldn't sway things to go where the way he wanted it. And part of it, we can even go as far back as to his contracts and the money that was flowing through it. Those coaching contracts that really began exploding with his is kind of what might have been the small domino in this whole the meme of the big domino and small domino is the players walking past his Ferrari every day, walking into the football complex. The last thing they'd see.
Yeah, suddenly they get a Ferrari now, right? Like that's part of the deal. And he couldn't make millions of dollars just appear out of nowhere and put Alabama in a position to compete with teams that are better suited for the NIL era, right? And in Alabama, he couldn't make Alabama have as much money as the Vatican, as somebody recently put it when they were begging for money from Alabama football fans. So it's tough. I understand. And, Alabama's in a difficult position, but they're paying Nick Saban $500,000 anyway. And maybe one day we'll find out what that got Alabama in 2024 and what it might get them in years beyond, as long as they're still paying him. So maybe he'll help them figure it out. They're certainly paying him enough to.
Yeah. No, we'll try to get a public records request for his annual performance review from Greg Byrne.
An itemized list of services rendered.
All right. Well, I think we've solved all these problems, and we've once again fixed college football here in the last 45 minutes or so. I want to say thanks to Michael Casagrande. You can read his work on AL.com. Thanks to Beat Everyone producer Matt Scalici, and thanks to our other producer John Hammontree as always. And you can find Beat Everyone on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Ben Flanagan with AL.com. We'll see you next time.